Hi, good afternoon, folks. Wayne Potter here from Giotto. We have Jimmy Lamb on the other side from Sawgrass, and we'd like to take you through decoration of garments. Now, I know the first thing that comes to mind, everybody says, oh, I got to have like this 60-inch wide press and this enormous heat transfer to get into this business. And I mean to tell you that's not true. I've done an awful lot of that commercially, but there's an awful lot you can do with your Sawgrass Virtuoso desktop systems. And that's what we're going to bring to you today, at least the start of a thought process and how you can use your equipment. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Well, thanks, Wayne. That's exactly right. Just what Wayne was saying there. We're going to look at the desktop applications of sublimating apparel. But if you're interested in all over sublimation, then I urge you to contact Giotto and talk to Wayne, because Wayne really knows that part of it. Well, he knows a lot, but I mean, in addition to everything else he knows, he definitely knows a good deal about the all over process, which is really cool, but also has its own set of challenges, we'll say, with it. But Wayne and Giotto can certainly help you out with any questions you have in that particular area. But for today, we're going to talk about sublimating apparel using your desktop system. Now, perhaps the most common problem that comes up, and we will address it, is what we call press lines, okay? And, you know, the first time you do a shirt with sublimation, you're probably going to end up with this. So hopefully we're going to keep you from having that problem as we go through. But with that said, let's move along here. I mean, full color sublimated apparel is hot. I mean, it's very popular out there right now. Poly performance products very popular as well. And as you probably know, poly performance polyester materials come in your traditional style of polyester, which is the slick, silky looking fabric, but it also comes in spun polyester, which looks and feels like cotton. But if you're buying spun polyester products that are poly performance means it has moisture wicking. So regardless of which direction you go, as long as it's poly performance, you're going to have the moisture wicking capabilities, which is what really is driving the particular marketplace right now for apparel and sublimated apparel. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when we start talking about doing apparel with sublimation is the fact we do not have white ink. So you can see the first t-shirt there is white, and when you print that soccer ball on there, those white areas are created by the background color, which is white. Okay, if you put that same image on a red shirt, then the soccer ball is going to have, you know, red areas instead of white areas. We do not have white ink. So when we start talking about doing colored garments, you have to keep in mind that without white ink, you cannot do a dark garment, number one, and you even have some limitations in light garments because you cannot reproduce the color white. Okay, but there are still plenty of applications for sublimation in apparel. White is a very popular color, by the way, and we can do light fabrics as well, understanding our limitations with the white ink for printing. So let's look at the challenges of apparel sublimation. Transfer lines is the very top of the list. Blue specks, ghosting, fiber content issues, fabric color issues, which I was just mentioning. We'll talk more about that. So let's start with transfer lines. This is the one that really gets everyone's attention. And if you look closely at the image on your screen, you will clearly see that there is a line down here below the word beach going from left to right, and then it goes vertical. Okay, so the vertical part's not maybe as obvious on your screen, but definitely the horizontal part is. Now, it's a razor thin little line, and if you're an embroiderer, for example, because I started with embroidery, so that's why I go back to embroidery, it kind of reminds you of a hoop mark. If you're not into embroidery, then you probably don't know what a hoop mark is. That's okay. The reality here, though, is this is permanent. Once we get that in there, we cannot get it out, okay? And the reason that you're getting that transfer line is the edge of the transfer paper is digging into the shirt fibers during pressing. And we say the fibers are melting. They're not melting like gooey and sticky, but they've been softened up through that heat, and when that edge of that paper digs in, that sharp edge, it leaves an impression, and unfortunately that impression is permanent. So your transfer lines will be permanent, okay? You can't get rid of them except with scissors. and then that means you got a big hole in the shirt where you had to cut everything out. So that doesn't really work either. The key is, of course, to prevent them. Now, one of the things that's floating around on the internet is, hey, why don't you just take your transfer paper and soften the edges by just tearing them like you see right here, okay? Now, the problem with that is occasionally it does improve the situation, but there are many times where you get a new kind of transfer line that looks like the so-called softened edges of the transfer. So it didn't really fix the problem. So I don't consider it to be a viable solution. I just want you to know that, okay? I have a better solution for you, and that is to use what is called a foam kit. With the foam kit, which is available from Giotto, it's manufactured by Vapor Apparel, and they manufacture poly-performance shirts. So they realized that the issues going on, and they wanted to come up with a solution so that you could sublimate, their apparel and get good quality sublimation without transfer lines. So it's a two-part process. Number one is using the high temperature foam under the garment, and number two is reducing your heat press settings for time, temperature, and pressure. And we're going to look at how all that works together here as we go. All right, so the apparel process starts with the high temperature foam kit, okay? And that kit's going to include foam, Teflon, and sample shirts for testing, as well as complete instructions. So you don't have to memorize everything I tell you, okay? The instructions will be there, but you can always watch back the video on this too. All right, so our first step is to prepare our foam. And this is a high temperature foam. This is not craft foam that you may purchase in a local arts and crafts store. Okay, so this is very specialized type of foam material. And it should be noted the foam can be used over and over again, so you don't have to create a piece of foam for every shirt. You usually can get a good pressing range of about 100 shirts before it starts to flatten out. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that your foam is smaller than the transfer, larger than the image, okay? Smaller than the transfer paper, larger than the image. Ideally, maybe 1 to 2 inch margins, within there, okay? And if you're printing right to the edge of the paper, it makes it difficult to really use the foam properly, and to be honest. You want to have a little bit of white space there so you can line things up the right way. Now, what I was doing here in the picture is being very precise. So the foam comes in a long roll, rolled it out. I put down a sheet of standard transfer paper that I use routinely, and I actually traced it using, a little black Sharpie, the actual paper, so I would have the ability to see the edge of the paper on the foam. Now, you want the foam to be smaller than the paper, so I actually just came back and measured in another line just inside of it and traced it. That's where I'm actually going to cut with the scissors. That way, this piece of foam will be smaller than the paper. That's what I'm shooting for, okay? So good ½ inch shorter in all directions in the transfer sheet is what we really want to achieve with that final piece of foam. And it doesn't have to look pretty, because let me tell you, when you go to cut this stuff, it tends to look kind of jagged. It's easy to cut. It's just not easy to cut straight. Now, we also want to make sure that when we're cutting it, that we bevel the edges. So if you look closely here, you'll see the edge is angled inward here, okay? It's angled inward, and this is the way that we would lay it down the heat press with the angling facing inward to the foam, okay? About 45 degrees is what you're shooting for. Doesn't have to be pretty, but about 45 degrees. This is my end result. Not very pretty at all, but it's working, okay, because it is smaller than the transfer sheet, larger than the image, is beveled all the way around. So I've got that set up the right way. Verify that fit, make sure it's right for your paper, and then if you're using the same paper over and over again, you should be able to use the same piece of foam over and over again. Like I said, you don't have to go out and cut 100 pieces of this stuff. One should suffice for the given size that you prefer to do your sublimation with. Now, we're going to build sort of a sandwich on our heat press. And the very first layer that we're going to put down is the foam. We're going to lay the foam down first. Shirt ultimately is going to lay over the foam. We don't put the foam inside the shirt. The shirt will lay over it. But there's some other pieces into this little stack as we set things up. So here I've laid the foam out on the bottom platen of the heat press. If you're going to do a lot of pressing of the same size image, You may even consider using just a small amount of the temporary spray adhesive on the bottom of that foam so you can just lightly kind of tack it to the bottom platen, and it just helps hold it in place as you go through your production steps. All right, so we put it down on the platen, beveled side up. Then we take a look at our settings, and this is the one that kind of throws people off a little bit because we want to change these settings, okay? So these are the non-traditional settings that are called for when we're doing apparel sublimation. These also came from Vapor. This is what they recommend for their apparel. You're probably going to experiment and see and what works best for each type of apparel you want to use. These are good starting points, 35 to 45 seconds, and I use that and don't change it much. 380 degrees is pretty low. You would ideally be able to do at least 390, but you may start at 380 and then gradually, you maybe increase to 385, then 390, and if you don't have any transfer lines, the idea is to get that back up to 400 if you could. You probably cannot, but getting closer to 400 probably is going to give you better, more brilliant color. So this is sort of the low end, but it's kind of like if you have no transfer line here, you can increase settings until you start to see them. Okay, just kind of document what you're doing so you know what's affecting it the most. You'll see for pressure as per compression, well, I'm going to show you what I mean with that. Here I took the piece of foam and I went and put it between the top and bottom platen and adjusted my pressure so that when the platen's fully closed, it doesn't compress the foam by any more than 1/2. Okay, no more than half of its original height has it been compressed. So it gives you a visual setting for the right pressure because, a lot of us, we have a heat press with a big black knob. We have no idea what the, setting is other than we put more pressure or less pressure. Here we have a visual recommendation of getting that pressure right. In fact, what I do is I keep a small square of this foam right by my heat press without beveled edges because it's easier to see if it doesn't have a beveled edge, right? And I can just slip that in and use it to basically calibrate my heat press for sublimating apparel. And then once it's all set up, I just put my little square back down under the heat press until I need it again. So anyway, that's how we do and set it up visually. Very important step there. Okay, so that original piece of foam that we cut, we should have it sitting there on that lower platen. And then you're going to layer it with a piece of Teflon, okay? And I know a lot of times we, when we start talking about Teflon as blowout sheets, we start leaning towards paper and whatnot. But the idea of here is we're putting Teflon on top of the foam to further soften the foam. And so once you lay it on there and completely cover it, then you're going to look at putting your shirt over on top of that. Now, before you put the shirt on there, what you want to do is you want to roll the surface of the shirt with a lint roller. And this is going to remove any unseen particles. And trust me, there are some unseen particles that are the result of making polyester apparel. And those things can cause what we call blue specks. Okay, so if we don't get those up when we go through the heat press process, we'll probably end up with little blue specks here and there on the shirt. So you want to roll the entire surface of the shirt that will be under the heat press with a lint roller to make sure you don't have blue specks. So you want to do that before you actually put it onto the heat press. Okay, so we're going to roll the shirt and then we're going to go lay it out on top of the foam. And remember, the foam has Teflon on top of it. But once I lay the shirt on it, you can actually see the impression of the foam through the shirt. So you will be able to see and line up the shirt with the foam once you put the shirt down. Again, you don't need to stick the foam inside the shirt. Place the t-shirt on top of the foam, okay? That's the process. All right, the next step is we want to make sure we can secure our transfer to the shirt so it doesn't shift and cause ghosting. And the best way to do that is with a light mist of a textile spray adhesive. The 3M spray mount works fine. It's a temporary spray adhesive. You can buy that at Walmart. The Albatross 1077, the reason I have that one there is works great on apparel, but I've actually used that successfully on some non-apparel items as well. So that one works okay. I've done it on some Photoplex and stuff and done very well with it. Whereas the 3M, when I went and put it on a Photoplex, it didn't work so well. Okay, but both of these work fine for textiles. I don't like using heat tape on a fabric. It just it's hard to pull it off. It stretches the fabric, so I prefer not to use that. Now, the reason that this is so important is because when we open the heat press and release the pressure, that large piece of transfer paper on top of the shirt has a tendency to move. And if it moves slightly, it will cause ghosting. We want to make sure it cannot move when we open the heat press. Keep in mind that under normal situation, when you close the heat press on anything, you're compressing it somewhat so that when you open it, it kind of uncompresses and has an outward push against that paper. And this is very predominant with apparel because apparel compresses a lot better than a wooden plaque. And then when you have the foam underneath it as well, you got a lot of compression going on. So you have a springing type of action when you open that heat press to push the paper up and cause it to possibly slide. So that's why we want to eliminate ghosting, or that's why we want to use the adhesive spray to eliminate ghosting, because we want to make sure it cannot move. Just a very, very light spritz on there, very light. We're not trying to glue the paper down. We just want a light tack so it holds it in place. That's all we need to do. Once we do that, we can go lay the paper on the shirt, line it up using the reference of the foam to make sure it all lines up. And once you place this over the foam and you really can't see anymore, you can use your fingers to feel where the foam is so that you can line up that particular transfer so that it's properly aligned with the foam, okay? So that's what we're doing here, getting it all positioned out the right way. And then finally, we're going to cover it with another sheet of Teflon, or better yet, a sheet of newsprint, which is our blowout sheet. So that's what goes on top. So real quick, we had the foam, then we had Teflon, then we had the shirt, then we had the transfer, and then we have a blowout sheet on top. Now you go and get your pressing parameters all set up and ready to go using the numbers that we just described earlier. And different brands of shirt may need different settings, but go ahead and dial all that in. And now we're going to press the shirt. Once we open it up, we immediately pull the transfer off. And actually, since we use that spray adhesive, what I'll do is just take one corner of the transfer while I'm pressing down on the shirt, and then just peel that transfer back and away in a pretty nice, clean motion. You shouldn't have any transfer lines, and you shouldn't have any blue specks, and you shouldn't have any ghosting if you did everything right. Okay, and that's the process. It's not that difficult, but I do suggest that you do some test runs, because you do need to play with the variables of your time, temperature, and pressure. I'm also going to tell you that not every shirt sublimates well. Just because it's polyester doesn't mean that it sublimates well. You want to keep that in mind. And I have found shirts where I could just never make them work well. But with all the effort it took to get rid of the transfer line, we ended up with imaging problems where the colors weren't very bright. And so you do have to test some of your shirts and find out if they're going to work for you or not before you go out and sell them. Well, let's talk about a few other aspects here. Let's talk about blended fabrics. Now, sublimation only bonds with polyester, okay? It only bonds with polyester. And then there are some products in the marketplace that will allow you to place sublimation within certain boundaries onto a cotton surface, but sublimation itself will not bond with cotton. Only bonds to polyester, okay? So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Doesn't bond to bamboo, to wool, to rayon, cotton, any of those things, okay? Only polyester. Sublimation only goes to polyester. Okay, so what I was saying here is sublimation, 100% polyester. It will also work with 50-50 polycotton. It will not bond to the cotton aspect. It only bonds to the poly aspect. So what you get is something that looks, I'll use the term faded, okay? Faded, washed out. But it becomes a nice effect because many times that's a very popular look. And if you start using terminology like vintage and retro, you can actually raise the perceived value of the look. I've been known to tell a customer that I had a great vision of how to produce their artwork and to use a vintage or a distressed, or whatever the appropriate word is for you, retro, and it would really add a lot of life to their particular logo. It would cost a little bit more, but it's worth the investment. That didn't really cost more. No. It was the exact same amount of time and material to be able to do the blend, and it was the 100% poly. In fact, a 50-50 shirt is cheaper than 100% poly But yet by me kind of raising perceived value by the terminology that I'm using, I'm actually getting more money for the process. So yes, we can do blends. Now, one of the other things to be aware of with a blend is the fact that the first time you wash it, it will fade slightly. Now, when you're doing 100% polyester, when you wash it, it doesn't fade at all, ever. But if it's a blend, some of that sublimation got caught up with the cotton fibers. First time you wash it, it will fade a little bit. And what I would suggest that you do pretty much with any type of apparel product that you work with, but this is what I do, especially when I'm doing the 50/50s, is I'll buy 3 shirts and I'll put the same logo on all 3 of those 50/50s. The first one I just set aside after I press it. The second one I wash one and dry one time, and I mark it, wash, dry one time. And then the third one I do it 5 times. And then you can lay them out and you can see how much fading occurred, so you'll be aware of that. And you should see some fading on the first wash, but the one that you wash 5 times usually looks exactly like the one that you washed 1 time. Okay, so just keep that part in mind. All right, what about colored fabrics? When you go into colored fabrics, what is the best color for sublimation? White. I mean, white really is. It's not the only color, but it is the best color, okay, though we can do some light colors possibly, okay? Keep in mind that digital inks are transparent, meaning the background color can affect the color of the ink that's been laid over the background, all right? So when we put it on white, there's never that particular issue. But if I put it on a darker fabric, then it can affect the image itself. And dark colors, we really can't do dark colors at all, okay? Because if you look at a dark color and we go to sublimate it, sublimation, the ink has to be significantly darker than the background. Well, what's darker than black? Not much. Now, in the marketplace, if you see people doing black shirts, printing it with ink, then they typically are using a base of white ink to create a white area from which they then put the colored ink on top of. But we don't have white ink for sublimation, so we're unable to do that, okay? So we cannot do darks. You can do darks, you just can't see them. Okay, then we have to, in addition to making a white base for color to go on top, we would also need white ink to create the color white, which I was mentioning at the very beginning. So if you look at these 2 t-shirts here, the one that we printed in white has a white section, which is the eagle. And it's actually printed as no color because there's no white ink, and the white fabric creates the color needed for the eagle. Now when I put it on the blue shirt, you can see all the white areas are now blue because it's the color of the shirt that makes up for the white areas. But I also want you to notice that eagles here is a little different than eagles over there, and that's that background color affecting the ink color. And that's why you have to be aware of that. Maybe you don't even need white ink for the particular image, but you still may have an issue where the background color affects the ink color of the image, okay? So definitely be aware of that. If you're going to work with colored garments, you may have to tweak the colors just a little bit. Now, we mentioned all over, and it turns out I do have a couple of slides in here, so I'm going to mention all over briefly. All over printing is a process where you start with a white garment and then you create a sublimation transfer that's as large as the front of the garment and one that's as large as the back of the garment, so that you're printing the garment and recoloring the garment all at the same time. Then you don't need white ink, because if you started with a white garment and left a white area open, then who needs white ink? You have the white. But large format sublimation requires large printers and large heat presses, and there's a lot of techniques that go into it as well. So it is not, the concept is simple. The execution is a little bit more challenging. So definitely, if you have need for that, then talk to Wayne, talk to the great folks here at Giotto, and they can kind of help you out with that as well. Okay, I want to mention another area that we tend to run into, especially with colored fabric. And colored fabrics, you see these different colors here. We do kind of get limited on our sublimation colors. But when you're using a colored fabric, you don't always have to have a lot of color in your sublimation. You can get away with single color, 2, 3 color logos on there. And the fabric itself becomes kind of exciting, it adds a whole lot of color there. But one of the problems is when manufacturers make colored garments, they have to dye either the individual fibers that will be knit into the shirt or the fabric itself. One way or the other, they have to dye the fabric, okay, the material, to get the color. Now, when they dye it, they also heat set it to cure the dye. And the question becomes, what temperature do they heat set it at? Most of them couldn't even tell you, okay? So if you have a shirt, for example, where it was heat set at 300 degrees for the fabric color, and you're running close to 400 degrees with your heat press, it may actually fade the color of the shirt where the heat press came in contact with the shirt. Okay, this isn't about transfer lines at all. This is just fading of the ink color that was used, or the dye color that was used in the fabric. So this is why you need to test fabrics when you go to colored garments to make sure you don't have this particular thing happen to you, okay? One of the things that we actually did, and it worked for this particular logo, is this is a rounded logo, so when we were pressing it and we were getting a little bit of fading in there, we actually used foam that was cut to the size of the image so that it was raising the shirt up off the surface only in the rounded area, okay? So the fading was occurring within that logo, but you couldn't see it on the outer edges of the logo. And, you know, we were just lucky that one particular setup actually worked out pretty good, okay? So, you know, that's just one of those extra little tricks that can be used in your process. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to cover today. Wayne, you may want to join in now and maybe add in some more insight, because I know you've done a lot of apparel sublimation yourself.
Yeah, Jimmy. Over the years, I have everything from children's tights and little girls' panties all the way up through outerwear. The interesting thing about the process, the sawgrass process, is the consistency and the stability of the ink system as compared to what I've experienced in the past on wide format printing. And I can tell you that it's very, very important for you in producing your product, because you can be relatively sure that every time you print a transfer, that there will be consistency from transfer to transfer, but also from inkset to inkset. And that will be very, very important to you, especially if you have a customer base that's sensitive to color. Another thing that you may want to think about, and it was evident in one of the photographs that Jimmy has there, is that you don't have to think about decorating the center of the garment. You can decorate the side of the garment with, at least with a Virtuoso 800. You certainly have enough space to decorate it and let it fall off the side of the image. Or you can decorate the sleeve or part of the sleeve of the garment. So again, there's a lot of things that you can creatively do that will add value to that garment without the need for all over printing. All over printing is going to require you to print an enormously wide heat transfer, and I kind of referred to that in the beginning. When I say enormously wide, you're talking about 44 or better, because you have to put an entire transfer over the garment itself. But again, there are a lot of very interesting techniques. I have a customer that decorates just the back, what you see of the shirt. They take the tag out, they decorate just the back of what you see of the shirt, and then they over tag it. And it's kind of an interesting look. And then they have another decoration on the front of the garment, done with another type of a transfer. So again, that's a matter of creativity. The biggest thing I think that Jimmy has touched on here is the color change that occurs from applying a transfer to a garment that's been heat set, dye that's been heat set. That's a very important thing to be aware of. And the whole thing of transfer lines is a very important thing to be aware of. because once you set the fabric with those lines, you're kind of stuck with it. And if you're not attentive to that, especially if you have people in the shop doing it, you walk away, go out to lunch, and you come back, and voila, what have you got? A pile of stuff that nobody wants to buy. So I guess that would be my insight into it. I think there's a tremendous amount of business for decoration and what I call engineered decoration of garments. That is, garments that are already fabricated and decoration of those, either in the center, the sleeve, the side, the back, and so forth. And it can all be done with your Virtuoso printer. So after you get done printing mugs and phone cases and so forth, there's a whole other area you can focus on. And if you take and create some creative art and take it to some of your customers, they may really catch on to it. Thanks, Jimmy.
Well, thanks. Great points there, Wayne. I knew your experience would be very valuable in this particular subject. So that pretty much wraps up what I have, and I appreciate the opportunity for being able to join in and share a little bit with everybody, because the apparel production process is a little different than everything else, but it has so much potential too, and it's an important part of sublimation. So being able to do it certainly gives you some more revenue streams. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Wayne, for inviting me in, and look forward to some future sessions with you.
Okay, Jimmy, thank you, and thank everyone. And if there's anything that we can do at Giotto to help you in terms of exploring these processes, feel free to give us a call. You have our 800 number. And thanks, Jimmy, and have a good day.